Hello and welcome to today's LGBTQ History Month Assembly, led by Mrs Daly and Matt. We hope you enjoy our research into the history of LGBTQ people. In the past, the state played a major role in repressing and controlling the lives of gay and bisexual men and women. As a result, LGBTQ people often had to hide their sexual orientation and gender identity in order to protect themselves, which led to the purposeful self-erasure of any evidence that could possibly out them. But why the secrecy? Criminalisation. While it was never illegal to be gay per se, many of the associated practices were criminalised. For example, in 1891, intimate relations between two men were classed as an unnatural offence under the Offences Against the Persons Act. While this may seem unjust and discriminatory according to modern standards, this Act of 1891 actually gives us an insight into the slow movement towards the greater acceptance of male homosexuality, as this law removed the death penalty for unnatural offences such as male intercourse, which had existed in England since the reign of Henry VIII in 1533, replacing it with a maximum term of 10 years imprisonment. Despite those legal changes, sexual relations between men continued to be stigmatised. The image on the screen shows an example from the list of unnatural offences from 1891. It records the case of two men, Canham and Barker, who were charged with having sex. Their case was one of consensual sex. Nevertheless, they were both sentenced to 10 years imprisonment. Baker later committed suicide after his sentencing. This document demonstrates how dangerous it was to live as a non-heterosexual man during the 19th century and explains the discretion shown by LGBTQ lives. So what about the rest of the LGBTQ spectrum? While it was never illegal for women to have relationships with other women, it wasn't socially acceptable. What is surprising here is what happened in 1921 and the discussion that took place in the government cabinet regarding an amendment to the Criminal Law Amendment Bill, which would make a relationship between women an offence. What is interesting is the reason that this didn't happen, which was essentially a backlash. The government felt that by criminalising same-sex relations between women would lead to greater visibility of lesbians and therefore encourage more lesbians to exist. Equally, it has never been illegal to be transgender, but the law in this country has made it very difficult at points. However, rather than discuss the rather negative history of the criminalisation of sexuality that fell outside what was societally accepted, Matt and I would like to talk to you today about a few of the many LGBTQ voices in British history and around the world.
A key debate in LGBTQ history is the question of terminology. How far can we use contemporary terms like gay, lesbian, and trans when talking about people from the past? The first thing to bear in mind is that most of the terms we use today will be completely unfamiliar to people living even in the early decades of the 20th century. Terms like heterosexual and straight are modern phenomena. Indeed, the idea of an individual having a clearly defined sexual orientation and all the ideas about the relationship between sex and gender that we take for granted today are primarily products of the 19th and 20th centuries. Projecting this terminology and the ideas that underpin it onto people of the past may sometimes seem necessary for clarity, but in order to make the diversity, fluidity, and unfamiliarity of how the people of the past thought and acted, it's important to bear in mind that they may have not self-identified in this way at all.
I'm sure that many of you have heard of the tragic tale of British mathematician Alan Turing, or of the trial of literary genius Oscar Wilde. But how many of you have heard of the Chevalier d'Eon? A celebrated 18th century soldier, diplomat and spy, the Chevalier d'Eon lived openly as a man and a woman in France and England at different stages of their life. The meaning of d'Eon's transformation has been dissected for centuries. Feminist writer Mary Wollstonecraft praised Dayon in their lifetime, and contemporary trans groups have named themselves in Dayon's honour. Born Charles on October 5, 1728 in France, Dayon came from a poor yet noble family. By 1756, Dayon joined King Louis XV's secret spy network, which operated without the knowledge of the French government. One legend about Dayon's clandestine adventures sees them sent out on a secret mission to conspire with Empress Elizabeth of Russia. To infiltrate the court and avoid detection, Dayon assumed the identity of Lady Leah de la Beaumont and served as a maid to the Empress. After their time as a spy, Dayon returned to France to become a captain of dragoons in the later stages of the 7-Year War. Dayon was sent to London in 1763 to help draft the peace treaty that ended the conflict, and they were rewarded for this service with the honorific title Chevalier, which is roughly equivalent to a knight in English. Despite this illustrious career, the Chevalier fell foul of the French government after being posted to London, and as leverage, Dayon began publishing secret diplomatic correspondence. Louis XV quietly gave Dayon a lifelong pension of 12,000 livres every year in exchange for reports about British politics. They spent the next decade in exile in London, still in service to their king. But when Louis XV died in 1774, his son, the ill-fated Louis XVI, wanted to negotiate the return of the Chevalier to France and, crucially, the return of any documents he possessed. After several months of discussion, Dayon agreed to return to France on the condition that the king would pay some of their substantial debts and their pension, and he would publicly recognise Dayon as a woman. The only thing that made the plan at all plausible was the fact that a lot of people, including the French government, already thought that Dayon was secretly a woman. As early as 1770, rumours began circulating in Britain and France that the Chevalier was actually a Chevalier. The gossip was such that in 1771, London bookmakers started taking bets on their gender, 3-to-1 odds that they were a woman. The bizarre public debate made Dayon's life difficult. They couldn't leave the house without armed guards, owing to the many people who wanted to see them naked. Yet their understandable refusal to publicly reveal their gender prolonged the debate for years. On November 21, 1777, Mademoiselle la Chevalier Dayon was formally presented at the court at Versailles, reborn after a 4-hour dressing session that included powdered hair, an elaborate dress and makeup. The reality of life as a woman was also disappointing, and their political, patriotic voice was essentially muted. When France joined the American War of Independence in 1778, Dayon petitioned the government to allow them to wear her dragoon captain's uniform once again, which they believed would enable them to go to war for France. Far from being moved, the government pressured them to enter a convent. Others at Versailles, where they were now living, told them that the only way they could have any political influence was through marriage. When Dayon continued to demand the government allow them to go to war, they were arrested and thrown into a dungeon beneath the Chateau of Dijon. They were released after 19 days and the promise that they would stop asking. In 1785, they moved back to England, ostensibly to settle some debts, but in reality seeking the freedom from monarchic despotism that Britain seemed to enjoy. They were welcomed in society as a heroine. But when the French Revolution began in 1789, Dayon's annual pension was suspended, and they found themselves broke. A sale of their famous collection of books couldn't cover their debts, and by 1791, Dayon, now in their 60s, resorted to putting on fencing exhibitions for money, styling themselves as a kind of swordsman warrior. They died May 21, 1810, at the age of 81, and then Mrs. Cole made a startling discovery when she went to dress her friend's body for burial. The woman who'd become a man to serve their king was biologically male. Dayon's obituary a few days later described them as a political character, most remembered for their questionable gender, which the paper said could now be reported as definitively male. Hardly what Dayon would have wanted.
The historian Margaret Macmillan said, "We can learn from history, but we can also deceive ourselves when we selectively take evidence from the past to justify what we have already made up our minds to do." Though the British public only began to see LGBTQ+ visibility from the 20th century onwards, to ignore the rich history of homosexuals in Britain prior to this would be a blatant misrepresentation of our past. Though we consider 2014 to be the birth of gay marriage, on February the 10th, 1834, Anne Lister and Anne Walker became the first known women to have a same-sex wedding ceremony. Though on the surface this may seem confusing, as gay marriage was only legalised 7 years ago, this wedding was a wedding of principle and not law. The pair moved in together into Lister's ancestral home, Shibden Hall. They exchanged rings and took communion in their parish church. Though the British public only began to see LGBTQ+ visibility from the 20th century onwards, to ignore the rich history of homosexuals in Britain prior to this would be a blatant misrepresentation of our past. Though we consider 2014 to be the birth of gay marriage, on February the 10th, 1834, Anne Lister and Anne Walker became the first known women to have a same-sex wedding ceremony. Though on the surface this may seem confusing, as gay marriage was only legalised 7 years ago, this wedding was a wedding of principle and not law. The pair moved in together into Lister's ancestral home, Shibden Hall. They exchanged rings and took communion in their parish church. Amidst a world which tried to make their love silent, this was the loudest declaration of their love that they could achieve. Anne Lister and Anne Walker considered themselves married. They didn't need the acknowledgement of a government which believed their union to be an abnormality. Aside from their marriage, the two Annes were brave in other ways too, acting as proud nonconformists during the Victorian era, which knew strict social norms. Whilst women were expected to wear light colours to symbolise their morality and virginity, Anne chose to wear black. And she did this cognizant of the backlash she would receive on a day-to-day basis. On the 28th of June 1818, she wrote, "The people generally remark as I pass along how much I am like a man." Then, on 16th of September 1823, she wrote, "I seem to have no proper dress. The people in Scarborough stare at me." Nevertheless, Anne was determined to not allow these comments to get her down, writing, "I have almost made up my mind always to wear black." Anne's expression of her gender perplexed the moralistic Victorians, with people in Halifax calling her Gentleman Jack, as they thought that anyone who dressed in such a masculine way would have to be a man. Anne's bravery here would have been striking, showing to other women around her that they too can break from the mould that Victorian society wanted them to fit into. Anne Walker too was brave, but she, without the remarkable self-confidence of Lister, suffered due to her bravery to be different, conflicted by a war in her mind between what the world wanted and what her heart wanted. On the 1st of November 1832, Lister wrote about how Walker was struggling to decide whether to be with Lister or to accept a traditional marriage with a man. She wrote, "Sat by her on the sofa, both of us perpetually with silent tears trickling down our cheeks, she quite undecided, fearing she should not be so happy with him as she might have been." This conflict took its toll on Walker, and 3 years after Lister's death, she was declared to be of unsound mind and was treated in York. The horrific effects of internalised homophobia are not confined to the past. Today, LGBTQ+ people are 1.5 times more likely to develop depression and anxiety compared to the rest of the population. The pain felt by Anne is felt by many across the world, even today. But if we look at LGBTQ history with an overly negative eye, it creates a false impression that the progress that has been made in the recent years came without precedent, and that we have made such progress that there is not much more to be done in the way of civil rights. The story of Anne Lister reveals many positive attitudes of regular people towards homosexuality. There is substantial evidence that suggests that Anne's family knew of her homosexuality and saw it as a benefit. Anne was placed in charge of Shibden Hall as her uncle knew that she would not marry a man who would then, due to the inequity in law at the time, be the owner of Shibden, thus stripping the long-term Lister family home from the Lister family. And through analysis of her diaries, historians have found no bad feeling on behalf of her family regarding her sexuality. Writing over 2 decades, Anne wrote 5 million words in her diaries, making them an incredible historical source. However, the most striking thing about these diaries is that all mention of her sexuality is written in code, a code made up of Greek letters and other symbols so as to hide the content from anyone else. This is why LGBTQ history is so difficult to reveal, because the endemic fear of persecution meant that it was hardly ever recorded to be revealed. But through the work of historians focusing on the community, it's a part of history that is flourishing, helping LGBTQ+ people today find themselves in the past, showing them that they are not novel in their bravery, but that they are standing on the shoulders of many who were brave enough to pave the way for them. Anne Lister and Anne Walker were a remarkable pair, and I'm sure that when the first lesbian couple married legally in the UK in 2014, they felt proud to be the next generation of innovators who aid the timeless strive towards complete equality.
Many of you may be aware of the cultural phenomenon that is RuPaul. However, how many of you know the story of the world's first drag queen? His name was William Dorsey Swan, but to his friends he was known as the Queen. Born in Maryland in 1860, Swan was the property of a white woman and endured slavery, the Civil War, racism, police surveillance, torture behind bars, and many other injustices. Many of you may be aware of the cultural phenomenon that is RuPaul. However, how many of you know the story of the world's first drag queen? His name was William Dorsey Swan, but to his friends he was known as the Queen. Born in Maryland in 1860, Swan was the property of a white woman and endured slavery, the Civil War, racism, police surveillance, torture behind bars, and many other injustices. But beginning in the 1880s, he not only became the first American activist to lead a queer resistance group, he also became in the same decade the first known person to dub himself a Queen of Drag, or more familiarly, a drag queen. A Washington Post article from April 13, 1888, gives us an insight into the life of Swan. The headline reads, Negro dive raided. 13 black men dressed as women surprised at Suffolk and arrested. According to another news account, more than a dozen escaped as the officers barged in and Swan tried to stop them, boldly telling the police lieutenant in charge, "You is no gentleman." In the ensuing brawl, the Queen's gorgeous dress of cream-coloured satin was torn to shreds. The fight was also one of the first known instances of violent resistance in the name of LGBTQ rights. To 19th century observers, Swan's dance party was a shocking and immoral fiasco perpetrated by a vanishingly tiny minority of freaks, as quoted in the Washington Post. The National Republican, another Washington daily, said of the men arrested in the raid, "It is safe to assert that the number living, as do those who were taken into custody last night, must be exceedingly small." Yet, despite their minuscule numbers, they made quite an impression. Hundreds of onlookers followed the men to the station to steal a glimpse of satin and silk. Drag balls had been going on in secret for years. Invitations to the dances, for instance, were often whispered to young men at the YMCA, and newspapers described the arrest of several black men wearing bewitching fascinators or cashmere dresses while en route to balls. In 1882, Swan served a jail term for stealing plates, silverware, and other party supplies. But the 1887 raid was the first time the wider world learned of him and the motley group of messengers, butlers, coachmen, and cooks. Strikingly, descriptions of balls from the 1930s are sprinkled with phrases like strike a pose, sashay across the floor, and vogue, such expressions which are now part of mainstream popular culture. Swan's drag balls came with grave risks to his guests' reputations and livelihoods. A large but undetermined number managed to flee during the police raids, but the names of those arrested and jailed were printed in the newspapers, where the men became targets of public scorn. With the news coverage, the world took interest. Everyone from neighbours and police to local officials and even psychiatrists. Now that the group was publicly known, it would prove to be a fascinating new subject for researchers trying to grapple with the complexities of human sexuality and psychology. Lacking any of the terms we use today, like cross-dresser, transgender, and gender non-conforming. Dr. Charles Hamilton Hughes described Swan's group in an 1893 medical journal as an organisation of coloured erotopaths and a lecherous gang of sexual perverts. On the one hand, the publicity made it more difficult for Swan and his friends to stay hidden from those who sought to do them harm. On the other, now that their existence was widely known, more people might have been interested in joining his secretive all-male family. Swan's gatherings continued, featuring folk songs and dances, including the wildly popular cakewalk, so named because the best dancer was awarded a hoe cake or other confection. Other guests dressed in women's clothes, though some wore men's suits. The actions of Swan and his followers were particularly significant in light of 19th century attitudes towards masculinity. At the start of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln urged an apprehensive nation to go forward without fear, with manly hearts, to fight a war that would eventually lead to full citizenship for all black men. In 1879, the Evening Star reported that the abolitionist Frederick Douglass advised that, with a full complement of manly qualities, the Negro could and would make himself respected in every part of the Republic. In post-Civil War America, there was very little patience for men who subverted gender norms. Though the Stonewall Uprising of 1969 is often touted as the beginning of the fight for gay liberation in the US, Swan's courageous example forces us to rethink the history of the movement, when it began, where it came from, and who its leaders were. Coming of age at a time when an entirely new form of freedom and self-determination was developing for African Americans, Swan and his house of butlers, coachmen, and cooks, the first African Americans to regularly hold cross-dressing balls and the first to fight for the right to do so, arguably laid the foundations of contemporary queer celebration and protest. Matt and I would like to thank you for your time today and for listening to our assembly. We hope that you found this interesting, and I would encourage you all to take advantage of the LGBTQ+ History Month essay competition, details of which are on the relevant Google Classroom. If you would like to talk about anything related to this video, then please contact any of the following. Details are now on screen. Thank you very much.